And this is just my experience. Here's a quote. There is no substitute for a good idea, for excellent research, or for good, clear writing. Said by this lady, Nora Newcomb, of Temple University, former editor of one of the American philosophical journals, psychological journals, sorry. I would say, as I said this morning, indeed, there is no substitute for good research and for a good idea, but you can work on your writing. If the writing is not perfect, that can be worked on. If the writing is excellent, but your idea is very bad, there's very little hope. Right? So the research needs to be good, the writing can be worked on. Having said that, let's have a look at a few example rejection letters, just to have some fun. I hope you can read this. I'll read it up anyway, if it's too far away. This is a letter, a rejection letter that was received from Nature. An article had been submitted to Nature. And highlighted in yellow, it says here, while they find your work of some potential interest, they have raised concerns which in our view are sufficiently important that they preclude publication of the work in Nature, at least in its present form. Should further experimental data allow you to address these criticisms, we would be happy to look at a revised manuscript. So this is a rejection by Nature after peer review, but they leave the door open for improvements. Right? Because it said at the moment, in its present form, this paper is not acceptable. Possibly in a revised form it may be acceptable, but you probably need to add more data and more significance to your data. That's one example. Here's another one, I have 4 in total. I believe this is Science, from the journal Science. And again in yellow here it says, your topic is certainly of appropriate scope for science, and your analysis is interesting, so that's good. However, following discussion among the editors and members of our board of reviewing advisors, it was given a lower priority ranking than others. So there's nothing really wrong with this paper, except that it wasn't as exciting as some of the other papers they received around the same time. And then, of course, Nature and Science are print journals. They have a limited amount of space that they can use every month or every few weeks when they publish a new issue, and that space, once it's filled, it's filled. So they have to prioritize the most interesting and most exciting articles every cycle of publication. And so in this particular case, that paper was felt to be of too low a priority to proceed to the peer review process. So in this case, it's a rejection, and there's nothing you can do about that. You just submit it to another journal. Here's one to, again, Nature. In yellow it says, you will see that, while they find your work of some potential interest, our referees raise concerns about the degree of novel insight and about the strength of the novel conclusions that can be drawn at this stage. In this case, the study was not novel enough. Now, you may disagree with that, and that's perfectly fine. And so, you can appeal to the editor, send him or her a letter and say, look, we don't quite agree with this assessment because the novelty of our work is the following, and then you outline that, in the hope that the editor will reconsider. Sometimes they do. I have seen this happen as a co-author on papers to the top journals, but most of the time it's still rejection, and you have to go elsewhere. And then finally, here's a letter, a sample rejection letter, to the Journal of Cell Biology. And let me read those 3 sentences in yellow. First, there are numerous technical and scientific issues raised in regard to the interpretation of the structural studies. That's quite negative feedback. Then, however, if you feel that you are able to address the reviewer's comments in full with additional data and analysis, we would be willing to re-review a completely revised manuscript. If you decide to resubmit your manuscript, please submit a cover letter describing the changes made and addressing the reviewer's comments point by point. So again, the door is left open here. As a negative initial assessment, this paper is not up to standards, but maybe you can make it up to standards by adding data or analysis or new interpretation. And then, very importantly, the final sentence said, if you resubmit, clarify what you did, right? Because you can resubmit, okay, here's our resubmitted paper, have a look at it, but the reviewers want to know what you changed, the editor wants to know what you changed, and not read through the whole paper and compare it to the previous paper. They simply don't have the time to do that. Editors and reviewers are busy people. They often do their work for free or for a very low fee, in addition to their job as academics. So make their life as easy as possible, and your chances of getting accepted are highest. I'm looking at the time, and like this morning, I think we should take a 5-minute break before we continue. So let's reconvene at 2:40. Continue, actually. Right, so we've seen a few examples of rejection letters, and it's likely you will get something like this at some point in your career, but there's nothing to worry about. So what do you do when you get a letter like this, right? Well, you receive the letter, you read it, and you don't immediately respond. But I have the tendency, I get a letter, it's critical of my work, which I don't like, right? No one likes being criticized. And I'm thinking, oh, the referee is wrong there, it is wrong there, this doesn't make any sense, let me type in a response. Don't do that, that's bad. Because you will not be polite in your response. That will antagonize the editor, if not the referee, and that's simply not a good idea. So normally when that happens, you know, I'm more mature now than when I was a student, of course. As a student I would say, oh, this is bad, and you know, I don't want to deal with this. These days, when I get a letter like that, or a number of referees' reports, I read them, I'm not happy, no one is happy to see their work criticized. I leave it for a few days. In the meantime, my brains will continue to work on what I read, and after a day or so, I will start to realize, maybe this referee was right after all. Right? Most of the time, if you get criticized for something, it means the referee didn't get it. What that means is that you didn't write it well, clearly enough for the referee to understand it. So what you need to do is rewrite your text such that the referee actually gets the point. So don't blame the referee. They are doing their job, and they do it for free most of the time. But make sure that your paper is as clear as possible. So that's my most important piece of advice, and I've learned this over the years. And my students still get very upset when they get rejected, but this happens. Understand why the referee came with the points that they came with, and why the editor therefore rejected that particular version of your paper for publication. It doesn't mean they rejected the final paper, of course. Respond to each and every of the points raised by the referee concisely, but clearly and to the point. And if for some reason you are not invited to resubmit to the same journal, do take the reviewer's comments into account. You got free feedback. Why not use it, right? Someone spent their time, several hours probably or longer, reading through your paper, thinking about it with their background in the field, their experts, their subject expertise, and they came up with possibly some good ideas that any other reviewer might have come up with as well. So why not use that information and improve your paper before you resubmit it to another journal? That's something that we should all really keep in mind. And the other thing is actually, if you were to resubmit your paper without any changes to another journal, as I said before, the field, any field is quite small. So the chances are that this other journal will send your paper to the same reviewer that critiqued it the first time around. And if they then see that nothing had been done with their comments, they might be quite annoyed. Right? So you better do something with the comments. It's free feedback, free advice. Right. So you might get to see these phrases. The paper is not acceptable in its present form. What this means is that it could potentially be accepted after revisions. That's what you get most of the time. Right? Most of the time in specialized research journals, you get phrases like that. We've seen already the paper did not get a high enough priority. In print journals like Nature and Science, that means we have reached the limit of our pages, and we simply don't have space for yet another article, and it's not high enough on the list to make it into the journal. Well, that's bad, and that may mean that you have to submit the manuscript elsewhere. But it does mean that you have to resubmit it. Of course, sometimes you get also told that the study is interesting, but too preliminary. My wife tells me that she gets these comments quite regularly in experimental biology. And that means that they need more data. Now that is a problem in fields like biology because getting more data is expensive, right? You need solutions, you need all kinds of consumables, and so you need money for that. In my field, if I need more data, I just get it from a telescope which is freely accessible to me, or I get it from a data archive which is free as well. So we are actually quite a cheap field, but fields like biology require a lot of money. And so for me, if I get told this is too preliminary, well, I just get more data from whatever source I can get and it's okay. But for my wife, it would be a big deal. Or you can be told the study is interesting but technically flawed. Some data may be incomplete or missing, and so you may have to add new data, or you may have to make an argument why your study is technically correct, right? Because the referees may be mistaken as well. But then you have to explain that clearly, not only in your response to the referees' reports, but also possibly in the paper text itself. And then, this is one that we actually got recently. It says here the work is more appropriate for a specialized journal. That same student I told you about earlier, who got 2 articles in Nature, recently completed another very nice study, which he insisted that it should also be sent to Nature. I was a bit doubtful because I thought it was a bit too specialized, but anyway, he insisted, and he submitted it to Nature, and we got a response 2 days later saying exactly this: the work is more appropriate for a specialized journal. And this is right, because it was more specialized, and there's no problem with that, right? It's good work, it's just not appealing to a very broad readership, from engineers to biologists to astronomers, etc. It's just more for people in the same area of expertise, and that's perfectly fine. We've recently resubmitted it to another good journal in the field. Right, so we've been talking about rejection. Happens to all of us, from junior to senior. I have a short video here coming up, an interview with a senior professor in chemistry about how he dealt with rejection over his career. So let's watch it.
Oh, we have articles rejected all the time. Why are they rejected? Let me count the reasons. They're rejected because referees, of course, don't always understand what you're saying. Sometimes you send an article to, sometimes you send an article to a journal and it just doesn't seem like the right fit. A lot of the research that we do doesn't fit conveniently into one or another area, so we try this journal and we try that journal if the first one doesn't work. There are occasions when the referees are correct and they find something that we had not really thought about. There is some, normally not big error, but some piece that's missing. So that has to be corrected. And almost always the referees have something useful to say. So if they say it's rejected, and the editor says it's rejected, then you rewrite it, you look at what everyone has said, and you try it somewhere else. If it's rejected, but that's a formality, then you correct it and send it back, and if they say it's okay, but there are major revisions, then you make the major revisions, and in any event, you try to rework it and make it better. But the idea that papers will go in and be accepted is just loony. It's never happened in my life. Pretty rare. I mean, there are occasional circumstances in which things come back and say there's a terrific paper, but there's a misplaced comma on line 27 of page 2. I mean, that is effectively that. But even when the referees don't get it, which sometimes happens, that's our fault, not their fault. Because if they didn't get it and we think we get it, then what that says is that we didn't explain it correctly. So the referees are, even when they're really out to, cut great scars in your side, they are an essential part of the system. And one of the things I try to tell the students is, when you read the referees' reports, don't worry about the fact that they're abusive, they personally hate you, that they're out to ruin your career, any of that stuff. That's all incidental. What really makes a difference is that they have read your paper carefully, they've looked at it, and they have some response to it. And the fact that they have a response to it tells you something about how a reader will look at the paper, and that's always useful.